William Farel. You notice we're getting into people where it takes longer and longer to... Thomas Munster, and 3 minutes later, hey, let's move on to the next person. Melchior Hoffman. Well, we're kind of past that now. 1489, he's born in France. 1510, attends school in Paris. 1517, he gets his Master of Arts. 1519, professor of grammar and philosophy at the Collège Cardinal Lemoine in Paris. So he's on the fast track too. He's doing quite nicely for himself. Although I can't imagine anything as horrifying as being a professor of grammar. But that's really...
Philosophy.
Grammar and philosophy, no thank you.
1520, pulls away from the Roman Catholic Church. 1521, becomes a member of the Cercle de Meaux, a group put together by the reform-minded Bishop of Meaux, Guillaume Riconnet. 1522, appointed a diocesan preacher in Meaux by Guillaume Brissonnet. 1523-25, meets with Martin Bousset in Strasbourg and with Zwingli in Zurich. April 12, 1523, he is forbidden to preach in Meaux.
By who?
At the Catholic.
Oh.
February 1524, attends a religious conference in Basel where he presents his 13th thesis. He is rejected from Basel shortly afterwards.
Booted out.
Now, I realize that so far, I have not really presented somebody who deserves to be number 18 on our list. So we have not yet got to the key moment that got William Farel on our list. And you will know, when we get to it, you will know that we have reached the key moment.
Well, getting kicked out of the conference is kind of cool.
1520, February 1524, attends a religious conference in Basel, where he presents his 13th thesis. I just mentioned that. 1525, preaching in Montpellier, France, where he throws an image of St. Anthony into a river and barely escapes a mob. That might have got him 25, number 25.
Wow.
If he'd never done anything
Gets
else.
him on the list.
That's kind of cool. 1526, school teacher in Agel, Switzerland, under the pseudonym Guillaume Ursinus. 1528, attends a synod in Bern, which decides in favor of Protestantism, so we start to see the switch over. March 8th, 1528, commissioned to preach in Bern. December 1529, he makes converts in Neuchâtel, Switzerland. 1531, attends the Waldensian Synod in Chanfaran, where he preaches the Protestant cause. At this point, the Waldensians haven't officially become Protestant yet, but obviously there's a lot of similarities between the two groups. Okay, now you might be starting to get a hint of why he is on our list. October 2nd, 1532, he arrives in Geneva, Switzerland, and becomes a preacher. Dun, dun, dun. And in 1536, John Calvin is passing through Geneva on his way to anywhere else. And he plans on staying the night there, and then getting up and leaving the next day. And it is William Farel who shames him into remaining in Geneva, because Farel thinks this young guy is exactly what we need to be a preacher in Geneva, Switzerland. August 27, 1535, the Great Council of 200 issues an edict in favor of the Reformation. Zurich, Bern, Freiburg, Basel, and Geneva all become officially Protestant. May 21st, 1526, Geneva officially becomes Protestant. The Mass is abolished. Images and relics are removed from the churches. April 23rd, 1538, Farel and Calvin are officially deposed by the Great Council of Geneva. Calvin goes to Strasbourg, Farel to Basel. One of them will return, but only one. 1541, prompted by commercial interest and fear of a revived Catholicism, the Great Council asked Farel and Calvin to return to Geneva. Calvin returns, Farel does not. He's got a nice gig going, and he stays there. 1541 to 1565, he's a preacher in Neuchâtel, Switzerland. 1549, he attends the Consensus Tigrinus in Zurich with Calvin, the purpose of which is to align the theologies of Zurich and Geneva, also known as the theologies of Zwingli and Calvin. So he's still on good terms with Calvin. October 27, 1553, tries to convince Michael Servetus to recant his heretical views in Geneva. And it's probably a good idea, because Servetus didn't recant and Servetus was executed. 1564, at age 75 and in poor health, he travels back to Geneva to see John Calvin one more time before Calvin's death. So Farel is there in time to see Calvin on his deathbed. May 1565 says farewell to the Protestants in Metz. September 13th, 1565, he dies in the canton of Neuchâtel in Switzerland. May 4th, 1876, a monument to Farel is erected in Neuchâtel, where he preached for 25 years. He was a rabble-rouser. He was French, and he was an early Protestant. Cool hat, I think we can all agree. Often credited to bringing Protestantism to Western Switzerland. He also preached in France and in Germany. But ho-hum, that's not why he's on the list. He was probably run out of more cities than any other reformer, including Meaux, Montpellier, Neuchâtel, and Geneva. He's probably up there with Melchior Hoffman in terms of the number of cities he was run out of. He had a booming voice and a charismatic preaching style. He's probably a better preacher than Calvin, actually.
He's an early Baptist.
This is my favorite one. He is said to have once overpowered the bells of a Dominican monastery. The bells had been rung on purpose to drown him out. His voice was so loud, people could still hear his sermon over the ringing bells that were next door. I understand that because yesterday I gave a outside talk at the Booth Museum in Cartersville. And just as I'm ready to start talking about the wonders of the Atlanta campaign, the guy next door starts running his lawnmower. So I understand this. I understand. 1536, he convinced a young theologian named John Calvin to stay in Geneva. Geneva had planned on moving on in the morning.
Calvin,
So here it is. Here's the great moment. During that spring, 1536, Farel had been reading a book just published in French. It was called The Christian Institutes. Writer of this book was a young man from Picardy. Not really, but Farel read his book with great interest. This young man's name was Jean Cauvin, if we use the French.
And the book was a lot smaller.
Much more than a woman.
First edition, yeah.
It started out as an explanation of the Apostles' Creed.
It's a much shorter book.
One evening in the month of July that year, 1536, a young Frenchman who lived in Geneva came in great haste to Farel's lodging. John Calvin is here, he said. He's just arrived in a coach from France, and he is staying at an inn for the night. Tomorrow he's going on to Strasbourg. Farel started up and went to the inn. He found there a young man, 27 years old, pale and thin, and grave looking. Not especially charismatic. I mean, he may have already contracted tuberculosis. I mean, look at the description.
Yeah.
He seemed to be in bad health. He seemed shy and timid and reserved. Do not go to Strasbourg, said William Farel. Stay here and help me. The young man at once refused. Probably along the lines of, are you nuts? I'm heading to Strasbourg to see Martin Bosset. I'll be somebody there. The young man then at once refused. He had many reasons to give for doing so. He was not a teacher. He needed to learn. He wanted to study. His health was bad. He required rest. He was naturally of a fearful and timid disposition. He was not at all the man for active work.
He needed a few more excuses.
And the dog did his homework.
Farel looked sternly at the young man. Jonah also, he said, wanted to flee from the presence of the Lord, but the Lord cast him into the sea. But John Calvin replied, I cannot stay. I need quiet. I must study where I am not disturbed. I can do that in Strasbourg. but not in this nut house, Geneva. I added the nut. Then Farel fixed his eyes of fire on the young man and placed his hands on his head. He spoke in a voice of thunder, "May God curse your rest and curse your studies, if for their sake you flee from the work he would have you do." This would later be looked at as sort of the, you know, the blessing of Calvin to become the...
It sounded like a cursing.
Calvin trembled and sat speechless. He says it appeared to him that the hand of God was stretched down from heaven, that it lay hold of him and fixed him, whether he would or no, to the place he was so impatient to leave. At last he spoke, he said, "I will remain at Geneva. I give myself up to the Lord's good pleasure." And the moment had passed, and Calvin stayed, and with a slight interruption would be there for the next 27, 28 years. Farel remained close friends with Calvin until the latter's death in 1564. And although 75 years old, Farel made a long and arduous journey to Geneva to see Calvin on his deathbed. I think I have a description of that in the book.
Thank you.